I don't know of any other country whose elites are so determined the whole time to trash their own history and traditions. The best example, I think, is the Pakistani Muslim gangs. We are seeing potentially the Lebanon-isation of Britain. Keir Starmer tweeted a photo just a couple of weeks ago where I'm not sure I've seen something like that before. We've also promoted what you might call a hard multiculturalism. The Labour Party has become a movement of social activists and student radicals, understood less and less what you might call working class Britain, came to regard those communities with contempt. With Prince Harry, I think his behaviour has been absolutely appalling. They've bought completely into that kind of woke agenda.
Paul Embery, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you here. I'm going to go straight into it. Is the UK, and to what extent is it, now an airport?
I think it's probably a fair analogy. I think there is a sense among people that we're almost a bit of a global hub rather than a home. And I think that cuts against the instincts of lots of people, because whilst I think by and large we are a tolerant, welcoming nation, I still think people like the idea that Britain is their home. It's not a shop, it's not an airport. We're not here just for people to pass through, to carry out transactions and then disappear and then maybe come back again in the future at some point. And I think there's a sense also that many people within the political establishment see it in that way, as an airport. And that, again, conflicts, I think, with most people, particularly working class people, in my view. Their sense of belonging, their sense of place, their sense of rootedness. And I think that difference in mindset, which has been exposed, I think, over the last kind of 20 or 30 years, is a large part of the reason why we've had some of the turbulence within the British political system and socially in our country for quite a while now.
When you speak about those people at the top who maybe want it to appear like an airport, is that when we get into globalism and things like Davos? And what are those things? Because they're not things that I've actually covered that much.
Well, I think there are communities in Britain, working class communities in Britain, neglected coastal communities in Britain, some rural communities as well, which feel left behind by globalisation, impacted by austerity, impacted by the effects on their cultural security of the new global market. And they feel that actually it's the political establishment that has largely inflicted that on them. And not necessarily just the left, although I think the left has been a driver of much of it. But I think it's something that now crosses the party political divide. And I think these are people who have looked at towards the political establishment when these things were changing in their lives and in their communities, and looked for support and found a political establishment that was largely tin-eared to their concerns and who simply didn't see the world in the way that they saw it. And these are quite often communities that place a high value on place and community and belonging and rootedness and social solidarity. Those things matter to them, and quite often they might have what you might call traditional views around, crime and family and religion and immigration and welfare, morality, all of that kind of stuff. But the establishment was largely kind of infected with this liberal progressivism, a radical kind of liberal progressivism as well. And I think that created a chasm, if you like, between ordinary people and the political establishment, people who, yes, do go to Davos and places like that, and looked upon those communities when they were seeking assistance and asking for a bit of respite, and kind of thought, well, how can you not see the world in the way that we do? The sunlit uplands of cosmopolitan liberalism, this is enriching and it's wonderful and it's going to benefit you economically because there'll be a couple of extra points on GDP. And it's going to enrich you culturally because we're going to have these wonderfully diverse communities. And actually, that wasn't what happened for those communities. So yeah, there is a complete difference in worldview and ideology between large parts of the establishment and those communities. I think that's pretty obvious now. I don't think anyone can seriously doubt that.
And to what extent is it sort of conspiracy theory realms? I mean, what are sort of the elites, let's call them, the Davos people? What are they sort of plotting and to what end?
Well, I don't buy any of that stuff, I have to say. It's not my thing at all. And I guess some people might watch this and say, yeah, but you don't know what's really going on. And you're not kind of up to speed on it. And, you hear stuff about the World Economic Forum. I don't think I could tell you what the World Economic Forum is. That may be ignorance on my part. I've never written a thing or spoken a thing, probably until now, actually, about the World Economic Forum. Davos clearly, happens and world leaders go there and mix, and you don't quite know what goes on behind the scenes. You've got the Bilderberg group and stuff like that. I don't particularly buy into the idea that there is a global elite which is actively operating behind the scenes in order to kind of shape the world in the way that they want it and in their interests and so on. For me, I think what happens a lot of the time is politicians will come through the ranks and they will see that actually the upper echelons of political life in Britain and our institutions are largely dominated by people who have that kind of liberal progressive worldview, and that actually to get on in your career, you're probably going to have to subscribe to that yourself, because if you don't, then you're not going to be welcome to dinner parties in North London. You're not going to be welcome, particularly at Davos. And this probably touches on J.D. Vance's speech to the Munich Security Conference a couple of weeks ago, where I think he did actually, whatever political differences I've got with him, he did tell some home truths about the chasm that's opened up between the elites across the West and ordinary people over issues like globalization and mass migration and the neglect of working class communities and the patronising attitude of much of the political establishment. So it's there and it exists, but I think people largely adopt that view because they want to seek the metropolitan embrace when they're on a career path rather than any particular conspiracy behind it.
That aligns, I think, with how I feel about basic human psychology. People don't see themselves as bad, evil, Bill Gates trying to kill everyone. And even that's just lost me half the audience now, because I know people like to hate Bill Gates. I don't know enough about Bill Gates for you to hate me for my view on Bill Gates, anyone listening. But we just sort of move and we get incentivized to feel a certain way, and then we think we just came up with that by ourselves, and that's how we feel. And it's the system has sort of worked against people big time.
I think it's very comforting for some people when the world isn't working the way they would like it to, and when they're suffering themselves. They're suffering from, for example, economic insecurity, or they can't get a job, or they're living in a country like ours, which I think is undeveloping, and public services are not working, and they feel that the political establishment doesn't understand them. I think it's quite comforting for people to retreat into that kind of conspiracy world, that these people are evil, they really are the enemy. It is all being organised behind the scenes, and you have to resist that, I think. To give an example, when the Princess of Wales was recovering from cancer, and obviously she was out of the public eye for a long time. I saw lots of stuff on social media, including from otherwise kind of reputable commentators, accounts that have got lots of followers and people who might otherwise say some quite sensible things, just playing into this idea that she'd already died kind of thing, or she'd been bumped off, or she was living in Hawaii and there was a body double who was kind of, you probably saw some of that yourself. Yeah. And the problem is when you buy into some of that stuff, what it does is it undermines the rest of your argument when you're trying to make entirely sensible arguments about the tenured political establishment, about the fact that this chasm exists between the liberal progressive establishment and ordinary working class communities. Because people who might otherwise be sympathetic to you go, you should have a tinfoil hat on, mate, because some of that is balmy. So it's easy to fall into that, but it needs to be resisted.
I suppose in their defense, the other side to that would be something like Epstein's Island, which is sort of for years people were saying, oh, the elites are getting young women and, well, I guess there was children, people saying, putting them all on an island and doing all these kinds of things. And it turned out they sort of were doing that.
And you can talk about, Hunter Biden's laptop and stuff like that. And that's true. Look, I mean, I'm not suggesting that sometimes what appear to be at first wild theories have in the past occasionally been proven to be justified. But I think that's as much to do with the fact that we have a media, particularly across the West now, that doesn't particularly do the job that it ought to do, and largely follows that kind of liberal progressive mindset, particularly a large part of our newspaper commentariat. And because of that, they don't ask the really challenging questions. I mean, when you look at, for example, some of the escapades we've had militarily over the last couple of decades or so, whether it's Ukraine, whether it was Libya in 2011, our approach to Syria, obviously Iraq and Afghanistan. The media, I mean, certainly Iraq later on when it became clear it was a catastrophe, they did. But by and large, and especially around Ukraine, for example, I think a large part of the media just buys the government line on some of that stuff, isn't particularly interested in the wider context, doesn't particularly ask the challenging questions. And, they often, I think, some of our media reporters have very close relationships in the SW1 bubble with some of our politicians. They know if they write challenging stuff or stuff that might expose a particular policy or a particular person, they might not have that access in the future. And I think it's as much to do with that, the fact that we have, probably the best example, I think, is the Pakistani Muslim rape gangs, where yes, the media did cover the convictions from time to time, but in a very matter-of-fact way. But there was no joining of the dots in the media. There were very few commentators who were saying, actually, we do need to examine the ethnic dimension, the cultural dimension. We do need to start asking questions about why some of this stuff is happening. We'll put investigators on the case and we'll get commentators to write columns about it. None of that happened because I think it was all too sensitive. We have far too much of an unquestioning media this day and age, I think.
You're a trade union activist, which just simplistically, I suppose, is sort of as left as it can be. That's the left, isn't it? And yet a lot of your views, for example, about that we should highlight grooming gangs, right? That doesn't seem to coincide with what a lot of the left are saying today. So is there a point at which you have to say, you know what, I guess I'm not a lefty? Or is it a case that the people who claim to be on the left today are not doing leftism right?
Well, I mean, I'm looked upon as a bit of a museum piece in the Labour movement now, but there would have been a time where the views that I espouse, and I would say economically, I'm probably as left as most people on the left, or certainly within the Labour Party. But some of the views I espouse around social cultural issues are now, frankly, seen as fascist in the Labour Party and the wider left. But I mean, of course, that wasn't always the case. I mean, the Labour Party has got a history of being a patriotic, communitarian party who understood the concerns and the priorities in the lives of working class people, and working class people were proud to vote for it, and in many cases saw it as their party. But there's no question that certainly over the last 20 years and probably over the last 30 years, the Labour Party and the left more broadly has become a movement for what you might call the professional and managerial classes, a movement of social activists and student radicals and urban liberals and graduates living in our fashionable cities and university towns, and didn't understand, or understood less and less, the world beyond the M25, what you might call post-industrial Britain, what you might call working class Britain, small town Britain. And not only less and less understood those communities, but more and more came to regard those communities with contempt. And at the same time as they were kind of embracing on the left a militant, if you like, social liberalism. So they rejected the idea of the family unit, or certainly didn't want to voice support for that, and issues around patriotism, for example, and traditional values and so on. All of that was seen as a bit of old hat, and adopted a very kind of militant progressive stance. On that level, they also adopted a kind of economically liberal agenda. So in the days of Tony Blair, for example, adopted what I would call largely a Thatcherite agenda, placing undue faith in market outcomes, allowing the city to reign supreme, independence of the Bank of England, seeing government as a necessary evil and not much more than that. And I think as that process took place, I think more and more people just saw the Labour Party, who did once see the Labour Party as their party, no longer recognised it and thought, you don't speak like me, you don't look like me, you don't understand my life. Probably the best example of that was the Gillian Duffy incident. Where in 2010, Gillian Duffy, this sort of elderly voter in Rochdale, during the election, Gordon Brown was visiting the constituency and left his microphone on, and simply because she had raised quite mild concerns about the impacts of immigration in her community, she was called a bigoted old woman. But the truth was, and I know this because of my involvement with the movement, lots of people in the movement do see the likes of Gillian Duffy in that way. They do think that people who raise concerns over the impacts of mass immigration in their communities are genuinely bigoted people. So we kind of got to this weird situation where a lot of the Labour Party, they knew that they needed the votes of those people. They needed, in order to form a government, they needed the votes of those working class communities, but they didn't want to be seen with them in public. They almost treated them like some sort of embarrassing elderly relative. And whereas the Labour Party at its most successful has always been a coalition. It's been a coalition between what I call Hampstead and Hartlepool and Hackney, forgive the alliteration. But you have Hampstead, which is, if you like, the kind of middle-class, white-collar intelligentsia, always been a part of the party. You've got Hartlepool, which is the blue-collar working-class element. And in more recent years, you've had the Hackney element, which is the younger, more kind of urban, cosmopolitan voter. To be successful, the Labour Party needs to hold all of that together. And when it has been successful, that's what it's managed to do. But as time went by, one element of that coalition, which was the Hartlepool element, the working class, blue collar, largely white working class, let's be blunt, it was looked upon by the party with contempt. So the coalition started to fracture. The party thought those people would never go Tory. They've got nowhere else to go. But they started to abstain in large numbers after about the year 2000. And then they did go to the Tories, as we know, in 2019. There's been a huge realignment in this country. Some people will say, but the Labour Party have now won all of those people back at the last general election. Not quite true. The Labour Party's support at the last election was wide, but very shallow. And if you look at the C2DEs, which is the occupational working class, the share that Labour won among that group did not increase between 2019 and 2024. So I'm not convinced the Labour Party can ever win those people back. We may be seeing, I think, the beginning of a very long-term realignment.
And would that then push Labour to try to win the votes even more of Muslims new to this country?
Well, I think there are some people in the Labour Party, and I've had this discussion with some people in the Labour Party who think, actually, we need to find a new constituency. That new constituency needs to be built around the young vote, the environmental vote, graduates, the city-based people. People who are kind of liberal, cosmopolitan in their attitudes towards life. And that needs to be our new coalition. And we really need to forget about people in Hartlepool and people in Mansfield and people in Wakefield and people in Dagenham, where I grew up. Because those people are, bigots and nativists and xenophobes anyway. We don't really need them. I think two things about that. I think, first of all, I don't think that strategy would work, actually. I think if the Labour Party is to succeed electorally, it always needs to hold together as much of that vote. If it completely dismisses the Hartlepools and the C2DEs, then I think it's got real problems on its hands. But secondly, I think it would be a betrayal of the Labour Party's historic mission. Right. The Labour Party was created out of the bowels of the trade union movement. It was created to speak for marginalised working class communities. And if Labour did decide to go, do you know what, let's forget those people and throw our lot in with middle class liberals and environmentalists.
And Islamists.
And Islamists, and there's a certain amount of that, then not necessarily Islamists, but certainly the Muslim vote as they would see it, then essentially it's not the Labour Party as we once knew it.
Do you worry that we, especially with the lack of national identity now, we might be going to that path that Lebanon and Iran went through, with rising numbers of Muslims and Labour incentivised perhaps to go for that vote?
I think that is possible, and I've actually said previously that we are seeing potentially the Lebanon-isation of Britain, where we are fragmenting into different discrete communities with their own kind of communal and sectoral interests. Keir Starmer tweeted a photo just a couple of weeks ago where he was sitting around the cabinet table in Downing Street speaking to Muslim leaders about his business strategy. I always wonder how these leaders get their jobs. I mean, they don't ever seem to be elected, do they?
No.
But anyway, it's a different issue, I guess. But so you're actually seeing the Prime Minister meeting with representatives of a particular religion, not about religious or faith-based or community issues, but about business and economic issues. That seems to me to be a new departure. I'm not sure I've seen something like that before. And I think that where in this country we once had a common culture, a common identifiable culture, which people largely understood, it was largely based around Christian values.
Mm-hmm. What would like a couple of words be, just to be like, this is what our culture was or is?
Well, I think Christian values probably sums it up. Now, you don't have to be a Christian to recognise that culture did exist. You don't have to be someone of faith to know that it did bind people together, that they kind of did understand it, that actually when you look at the impacts of Christianity in our country on our music, on our architecture, our laws, our cultural life. I mean, it's even an atheist would have to recognise that was a great unifying force in a cultural sense. Even if you rejected the kind of story behind it, it was a unifying force in a cultural sense. And we've become increasingly secular, which is one thing, but at the same time has become increasingly secular. And people may say, well, that's all fine, don't have a problem with that. But we've also promoted what you might call a hard multiculturalism, where we haven't simply said to people, look, if you come here, we of course believe as a free society that you should have the right to worship the God of your choice, to follow the religion of your choice, to eat the food of your choice, to wear the clothes of your choice, all of which is absolutely fine. We've gone further and adopted hard multiculturalism. You know, what I mentioned was soft multiculturalism. We've gone for hard multiculturalism, where state institutions and governments and local authorities actively promote different religions, different cultures, different ways of life. They actively promote separateness and difference and talk it up as a virtue. Now, at the same time as we've done that, I don't think it's any coincidence that we are seeing social disintegration in many of our communities. I don't say that our communities are powder kegs and they're about to explode into violence. I don't think that, actually. But I do think there is just this kind of resignation that people think, even in the same towns, you quite often have communities living cheek by jowl with each other, but very rarely interacting. That common culture simply doesn't exist anymore. And because of that, I think society just becomes more and more fragmented. And the danger is that we end up in a situation, some people would call it the Balkanization, or as I said, the Lebanon-isation, where you have within a single state, you actually have lots of different competing communities with different interests, no overarching common culture, and so people sort of just simply retreat to what they know, to their own familiarity. I saw a bit of that, if I may say so. I saw a bit of that. I grew up in the London borough of Barking and Dagenham. And I lived there for 30 odd years. And it was what you might call a very traditional white working class community. You had the big Ford factory made in Dagenham on the doorstep. It was at one time the biggest municipal housing estate in the world. It was basically a huge sprawling council estate. And there was, when I was growing up there, that common culture which everybody could identify with, almost like an unwritten moral code. At the turn of the century, we really started, like lots of working class communities, but particularly in Barking and Dagenham, and I cover this in my book, Despised, we started to see the impacts of globalisation in a really significant way. So we saw deindustrialisation, we saw rapid demographic change, and that disorientated many local people. They were bewildered by that phenomenon, they were disorientated by it, and they looked at their leaders, they looked at the political establishment, the Labour Party, Blair at the time, and said, look, can you slow this down? We understand change happens, but this is really violating our sense of order and our sense of place. And again, in a completely patronising way, the political establishment looked at that community and said, this is good for you. This is what the world is now. This is, it's going to improve GDP, cultural enrichment and all the rest of it. And what thousands of families did, and 40,000 people in the space of a decade in Barking and Dagenham, just simply upped and left and said that this community has changed so fundamentally and so rapidly. I was living there at the time, so I saw this. I knew it was going on. They said, look, this is not somewhere we recognise anymore. And so what they did is they went to places where culturally it was more familiar, they were more familiar with. Some people called it white flight, but it wasn't white flight. It wasn't about skin colour. It was simply a flight to familiarity, as some people have called it. So they'd go to Kent, or they'd go to the Essex coast, and places like Clacton-on-Sea are now called Little Dagenham. So that is what the impact can do on working class communities. That's the fragmentation and the atomisation that can happen. I've been arguing on the left for years that unless we get a grip of this, some of the things that did come to pass would come to pass. And I wasn't surprised that it did, frankly. It's
amazing. It does seem like it was so obvious it was going to all happen this way, in a sense. And it did do. And then, and in many respects, Tommy Robinson, who was vilified, and I know he's a complex figure, but when I was a kid, he was like, Voldemort, he was Hitler, he was the worst thing. And he grew up with one mosque in his local town. And it used to be okay. Remember, Stacey Dooley did a documentary in the BBC. We could actually talk about, this is a bit of an issue for local people. Couldn't do that now. So I guess what I'm saying is we've just had MPs calling for blasphemy laws. I think Starmer is actually about to do that. I saw Angela Rayner was going on about what was that? Islamophobia, new laws, new set of laws for these things as well.
Islamophobia Council, yeah.
And you think, and I think this as well, they're not these are not, Angela Rayner's not evil. These are not evil people thinking, well, how we're going to turn this into Islamabad or something, that we're going to make it harder for women to walk the streets. They're just ideologues, I suppose.
They're ideologues, and I think there's a certain amount of seeking social and political kudos by being seen as very enlightened and progressive and liberal on these views, and it's seen as very kind of inclusive. But the reality is that when they peddle a lot of these policies in the name of inclusivity, quite often it's exclusionary to a large part of the population. A large part of the population will say, well, do you know what? Muslims, for example, I think should be able to attend their mosque and to worship their God and to live their life as they see fit within the law. But actually, I don't think we need an Islamophobia council. I don't think we need to be ring-fencing Islam from criticism or scrutiny or even mockery, which is the fear I think a lot of people have. And I think there's a sense also among people that they understand that the reason politicians do this is particularly, with the Muslim community, it's not just about inclusivity and being seen as enlightened and progressive and all the rest of it. It's actually out of fear. There's a fear there that actually if we if we allow people to criticize a particular religion, if we allow people to burn a holy book or to depict a particular prophet in art, for example, then there's going to be riots in some communities. Well, sooner or later, you've got to make a decision. Do we challenge and push back on that stuff, or do we keep indulging it? Because if you keep indulging it, you get to a point where you have a school teacher in Batley in West Yorkshire, for example, who, without any malice at all, did what he did in terms of showing a prophet to the students, and now his life is changed forever, and he's still in hiding. No one, as far as I'm aware, has ever been brought before the law for the intimidation that particular teacher suffered. So sooner or later, we're going to have to decide, look, either we resist this and we push back, and we push back forcefully, and we say, look, yes, whilst on the one hand, all people of faith are entitled to follow their religion, what you're not entitled to do is to say, within our society, which has traditionally defended freedom of expression and satire, the right to criticise religions, you're not going to stop films from being shown in a theatre by bullying the theatre management. You're not going to demand that people be put in prison because they've burnt a holy book. I don't think people should burn holy books personally. Yeah. You shouldn't do it gratuitously. It's not something I would ever do. But equally, I don't think people should be arrested because they've decided to do it. If it's their own if it's their own personal property, that's a matter for them.
The scariest thing about the most recent guy who did that was, within a minute, just in the middle of London, there was just somebody walking by who was extreme enough to get a knife and jump on him with this big knife. And then seconds later, Deliveroo cyclist comes past and kicks him in the head. And it's like, that's just a random place in London, and it took minutes for that to happen. It feels, I feel like I've been told my whole life, like, oh, it's only a very, very tiny percentage of people of that belief system. I'm now starting to feel like, well, this is a belief system every bit as extreme as Scientology, let's say. And if we had 10% of our population Scientologists, I think there'd be a much bigger national conversation about it.
Well, I think, there are parts of Islam that actually I think are very worthy and virtuous. I think, the emphasis on family life, the abstinence from alcohol, not something I could ever do personally, but nonetheless, they do it because they believe in it, because they think it helps bring about a more ordered society and so on. I think you can go through the tenets of Islam and say, actually, there's a crossover between some of this stuff and traditional Christianity, if you like. So I wouldn't suggest that it's some sort of entire hateful religion, because it isn't. Although there are certainly elements within it that are backward and reactionary, and elements within its adherents who are certainly backward and reactionary, and it's that needs to be challenged. But at the same time, I think we have to be far more confident as a country about asserting our own way of life robustly, and our own culture and our own, if you like, Christian values. And I'm not a practicing Christian. I probably call myself a Christian agnostic. Tony Benn, my political hero, called himself that, and that's probably what I would call myself. But we are scared almost to assert, if you like, our way of life and our own history and our own traditions. And I don't know of any other country, frankly, whose elites are so determined the whole time to trash their own history and traditions and to kind of try to put them to one side in the name of trying to make everybody feel welcome. And I often use the example of Japan. Now, Japan is a very culturally homogenous country. It's quite confident about asserting its own culture and its own history. It's had its dark periods in its time, as all countries have, we know that. But nonetheless, now, nobody would look upon Japan now as anything less than a modern, civilized, broadly safe, peaceable nation. And Japan doesn't actively promote hard multiculturalism. It doesn't have open borders. Those people who visit are by and large treated tolerantly, and they've got the freedom to live their own way of life. So the idea that you have to adopt this hard multiculturalism in order to be a civilized country, that you can't have, if you like, a moderate nationalism. I'm not talking about a virulent nationalism, but a moderate nationalism like Japan, where you have a single overarching identifiable culture. You can't have that, because if you do, you're harking back to the 1930s and you're fascist adjacent and all the rubbish that gets spoken about it now. Countries like Japan, and there's other countries as well, I think just completely crush that myth. But we've got a political elite in this country, I think, who are just scared to do that. It's partly ideology and it's partly fear.
I feel like in Europe, nationalism is intrinsically linked to the right because of some of the history here. There are plenty of places where it's a very lefty cause. I mean, even here, some decades ago, in some parts, you were saying before that we had some pride in who we were. Countries like Argentina or Canada, often it's this exposed to the countries that feel like they're in the shadow of, Canada in the shadow of America, maybe Ireland in the shadow of the UK. The left is much fiercer about their nationalism.
Yeah, and even France, I guess, as well, to a certain degree. I mean, I remember when, shortly after Keir Starmer took over as Labour Party leader, 4 or 5 years ago, whatever it was now, he gave a speech in front of, I think there were 2 Union flags, one either side of him. And various kind of left-wing commentators on social media and elsewhere were horrified by it. People on the left who I knew, and people were saying, well, this shows that the Labour Party is falling for fascism and they're peddling this kind of right-wing nonsense and what have you. And of course, if a political leader in France stood in front of the tricolour, no one would bat an eyelid, as they wouldn't in most countries, actually.
It is bizarre.
But there's a sense among people across, and you touch on Europe, and we've seen it there as well. We've seen it in France, we've seen it in Italy, we're seeing it in Germany now, we've seen it in Austria, we've seen it in the Netherlands. And I think there's a crossover actually with Britain, in the sense that there are large parts of the populations in these countries, particularly working class people at the lower end of the social and economic scale, if you like, who again have been left behind by globalization, have been told by their political leaders that the new global market will be to their advantage, and largely have found that it hasn't been. If you tie that in with the, more than 15 years now of low economic growth across the West, the impact of deindustrialization, the impact of mass migration in these communities, lots of these people in these countries have begun to assert themselves. You see it with the Gilets jaunes in France, the yellow vest movement, which the left in this country, again, was horrified with. Thought that these people are fascists and, the white working class people marching for sovereignty. How dare they, marching against globalization. And by and large, these people, as I said, are just ordinary working class people who have seen the economic impacts and the social and cultural impacts of globalization in their communities, and have thought, do you know what, this has violated us. We are open, we are welcoming, we are tolerant, but you've just abused our good faith and you haven't delivered the prosperity that you said you were going to deliver. And what we want now is actually a bit more sovereignty, a fairer economic system, more economic justice. We want mass migration to be slowed down. We want our governments to be confident about asserting our own identity. It's funny, isn't it? The left are so immersed in identity politics, but when it comes to the identity that most people means most to most people, which is national identity, they say, "Oh no, that's not one we really want to encourage."
That's like our country, because others do embrace Japan, as you say. Imagine us going to Japan and saying, why aren't there more people who look like me on TV? I can't be happy unless there are. I mean, I understand that argument, of course, as well, but it just seems so presumptuous to move to a culture and not just try and adapt and fit in.
And there was a story in the Daily Telegraph a couple of days ago where they reported that Parliament is going to remove certain paintings, Lord Nelson being one of them, to make Parliament's artworks more diverse. you get to a point where it is quite obvious that many among the elites just dislike British history and British traditions. Now, that's their view. If that's what they want to feel, that's up to them. But when they try to impose it on everybody else, when the rest of the country can see actually we've got a ruling class that by and large dislikes the country and its traditions, and is constantly, in the name of diversity, promoting other traditions and other cultures, it just makes people react. And I think to a certain degree, if you look at the unrest that followed Southport last year, that wasn't just about the horrific murders that had taken place in Southport. That was, if you like, a catalyst for it. But I think it was something connected to a much deeper and longer lasting resentment in many of these communities over economic injustice, but over the scale of immigration and the lack of integration, and the level of crime in some communities and so on. And I'm not expressing, by the way, any sympathy here with the people who went out and did violence in their communities. Those people deserve to be locked up. But beyond those people, I think there was a large body of people who just felt actually we need to push back against an elite class in this country that just shows day after day it doesn't really like our country, doesn't like our traditions, at the same time as venerating almost other traditions and other cultures. I think that's become quite obvious.
Well, speaking of our culture, I mean, the head of state is the royal family. You've spoken about Prince Harry, for example, and you're not him, of course, but
no, close though.
There's a resemblance, isn't there? Bloody hell! I saw there was a thumbnail, and it seemed to be of Prince Harry because it was about Prince Harry, and it was, no, that's actually Paul. So there is, and
he's 10 years younger than me, so I'm quite happy to be mistaken for him.
Is he really?
Yeah,
I thought you'd be about the same age.
Yeah, well, flattery will get you everywhere.
There you go. Yeah, I thought you were younger actually. No, but you said his actions have been unforgivable. What did you mean by that? Well,
I mean, I'm not particularly a royalist. I've called myself an unenthusiastic Republican. I mean, I've got respect for the royal family as individuals, not necessarily a believer in the institution. Don't feel I owe them anything. Don't feel I'm the sort of person who would ordinarily rally to their defence. But nonetheless, I think they are people who I don't buy the argument that they're all skivers and they're all scroungers and we should put them all in council homes and make them work for a living and that kind of stuff. I think by and large they do work hard. I mean, the Queen was working up until 95, 96 years of age, whatever it was.
Unifying presence as well in a time when that's badly needed.
Yeah, to a degree. I don't buy that completely, but to a degree. I mean, if you look at the Second World War as an example, probably yes. But then again, you could say during Brexit there was no impact at all from the royal family, despite the division.
But just something. If there's no Christianity now, and there's no, what do we have as England? Well, we've got the royals and people like Paddington and the Queen. It's just it's something.
There's something there that people like in terms of the connection with the past. In terms of lots of people do see the monarchy as a unifying institution, and we do the pomp and ceremony pretty well. Whether it's the state opening of Parliament, the late Queen's funeral, the coronation, we the royal wedding, we carry off that stuff quite well. So even though I'm not necessarily a royalist, I have some sympathy with them on an individual level. And I think with Prince Harry, I mean, I think his behaviour has been absolutely appalling. I mean, and not just because he's a member of the royal family. I think anybody who goes on in front of the global media and publishes a book about some of the most intimate things that have occurred within their family. I mean, I've got a brother and we used to argue and fight all the time. I wouldn't dream of coming on here, for example, and talking about some of the private battles I might have had in the past with
What are some of the worst things your brother's done?
Oh, I couldn't possibly tell you. We were actually 15 months apart, very similar in age, so we used to have some scraps. But yeah, and I wouldn't dream of revealing some of that stuff. And I think any human who thinks that is an appropriate thing to do probably needs to have a look at themselves in the mirror. If he doesn't want to be a member of the royal family, if he and his wife don't want to cut ribbons, open hospitals, whatever, that's fine. And people shouldn't be forced to do something they don't want to do as a career path. But, go to America and live quietly. Go to America, do a bit of charity work, or, do whatever you want to do, but don't trash the family that you left behind. Lots of people will come to his defence and say, yeah, the royal family is a terribly racist institution and he's a breath of fresh air and all the rest of it. No, I think he behaved pretty appallingly.
Do you think for revenge or for money?
I think probably both. I mean, I can't make a window into his soul, even though I do look like him. But it seems to me quite obvious it was for both. He did the autobiography, which no doubt made him a lot of money. Various Netflix stuff I think they had going on, and clearly there was a river of blood between him and his brother and his father as well. And he even revealed the details of when his grandmother died and the conversations that he had with his father at the time, and going to Balmoral and the stuff that went on. I mean, I have to say, I think that just crosses a line. However he may feel he had been ill-treated, I think some of his responses were just dreadful.
I remember there's a bit in the book about Charles doing he tried to get in the room and Charles was saying, don't come in. And he was sort of on his head, standing on his head in his boxers, Charles. He was sort of, and what a way to
That was portray. In the book. I haven't read the book, but that was in the book.
That was in the book. I read it because at the time I was doing more on sort of royals on my old channel. And in terms of gossip, what a fascinating read, but he shouldn't have written it. But it led to all sorts, the image of the king, I wouldn't want to present my dad in that way, No, my dad's not even the king.
No, well, exactly. Regardless of the fact that he's the king, no decent person would want to go public with that sort of stuff. So I think it's a poor reflection on him as an individual.
Do you think Harry might have maybe with Meghan signed up to identity politics? That was I think even more fashionable a few years ago than it is now, and that was part of I'm a victim. I get to write all my truths.
Oh, I'm sure they've bought completely into that kind of woke agenda. It does seem quite clear to me that they are very much paid up members of the radical progressive class. And again, they may feel it genuinely, ideologically, they very possibly do, but so quite often, as I've said, these things are done for reasons of social kudos as well. But it's just tiresome. I think it's just tiresome.
It is. Well, do you think Charles III should remove Harry, Prince Andrew as well from the royal family?
I think they pretty much have been, haven't they, in all but name?
That's true.
They're living marginalised lives now, so far as I can see, and that's probably a wise thing on both counts, I think.
We've been talking about the left and its obsession with identity politics. Would someone like Owen Jones, is he some of the sort of worst examples of that? I believe in quite a broad church on the left, actually. There are probably some people who subscribe to my train of thought, fellow leftists, if you like, who think we need to banish certain elements from the left and destroy them and get rid of them from the Labour Party and so on. I'm generally not in favour of that. I'm generally not in favour of proscription or trying to drive people away from the party. And actually, when you look at the Labour Party, since it was formed, really, it's been a broad church. You have had a very active left within it. People like Tony Benn, people like Michael Foot, people like Dennis Skinner and Eric Heffer. These are all people who kind of came up from the left of the Labour Party and of the wider movement, and quite often have got a lot to contribute. Sometimes they come up with, some of the best ideas around economic injustice and how to reduce some of the real serious wealth and income inequalities that we've got in our country. When it comes to issues like war, the escapade in Iraq, it was largely the left of the party who drove the opposition to Tony Blair. Sometimes they're nuts. I mean, let's be blunt about it. Sometimes they are crazy, and particularly with some of the extreme wokery that they peddle.
I mean, this is marginal fringe stuff that they're trying to inculcate people into and trying to embed within mainstream politics, and they can't be allowed to succeed. But by and large, I believe in a broad church, and I think Tony Benn was one of my political heroes. Someone who believed in democracy, someone who believed in Parliament, someone who really didn't like the European Union, and if he was still alive at the time, would have been one of the main foot soldiers for the Brexit campaign. And those people still need to be involved, but they just need to be challenged where they talk nonsense, which they quite often do.
The Owen Jones stuff is like the quiz for Palestine and stuff like that.
Yeah, and if that's what floats your boat, and if that's what is your particular focus, then fine, get on with it. But the problem is, if you peddle fringe and minority causes, and you spend so much time and commit so much focus to it, then you've got to understand that there will be a correlation between that. If you want the wider left to adopt it, there's going to be a correlation between that, the time and focus that you commit to it, and the fact that you will start losing mainstream voters on a lot of this stuff. You've got to speak the language of ordinary people. What is it that motivates ordinary people? They want job security. They want to be able to have good, solid industries in their communities where they know that their son or daughter is going to be able to pursue a career and have job stability throughout. People will get made redundant from time to time or get sacked from time to time, but you've got to have thriving industry in your community. You've got to have well-funded public services. If your mum needs a hip operation, you want the comfort of knowing she can get into a hospital and get that operation quite quickly. They want their streets to be safe and to be policed properly. The police, I respect individual police officers, but as an institution, the police are woeful at what they do. There's a huge amount, I think, of unrecognised almost lawlessness on our streets, and people can see it. We've got a massive a chronic housing shortage in this country, which too many politicians just simply don't seem particularly fazed about. I think a lack of decent, sanitary, affordable housing actually leads to so many other social ills. I think there's a real connection between those things. Family breakdown, for example. Yeah. If you get the basics right and you show people that you're in touch with their lives on the basics, then they'll probably allow you the slack on some of this other stuff, international causes and so on. But the problem for the left, so much of the left, is it focused so much on causes that were, for many working class people, minority causes. LGBT rights, for example. Now, I'm not saying those issues are not important, but actually they're not what cuts it for many families who are suffering from economic insecurity, can't get on the housing ladder, can't find a job and so on. They've got drug dealers on the corner of their streets. The environmental movement, climate change. Again, I'm not saying it's not a particularly important issue, but for some politicians, it's all they ever talk about on the left. And for most people, they're kind of thinking, well, actually, it's all very well talking about climate change, but what about the here and now? What about my life now? You're talking about a fair transition. We're seeing industries closing. We're seeing jobs being lost potentially because of net zero. What does that mean for me and my family? So unless you're in tune with people's basic instincts and priorities, then you can kiss goodbye to winning them over on, in terms of the ballot box.
Are there signs that people have moved past some of the identity politics stuff? I saw Ash Sarkar was sort of pushing, almost talking as though she'd never been part of it. The comedian Catherine Ryan was doing the same thing just this morning, I think, coming out with some stuff like, that woke stuff. And it was people were putting up videos going, well, hang on, this was you a few years ago. Are we moving past it?
I think we are probably a bit more confident about pushing back now in a way that some people previously weren't. I think we are seeing some institutions rejecting some of the more extreme variations of it. Stonewall, for example, some of our institutions are pushing back against Stonewall, pushing back against some of the wilder demands of the trans lobby. I think the election of Trump has got the potential to do, the re-election of Trump, if you like, the second time around, has got the potential to do two things. I think it may make people in Britain and Europe be a bit more confident about pushing back in the way that they do. The DEI agenda now in America, they're really pushing back hard against it. I feel we need to do that in Britain, because I think the whole thing as it's now like Japanese knotweed. It's taken on a life of its own and has become so damaging, and is unrecognisable from its original mission in many ways. So I think lots of people on this side of the pond will feel a level of confidence about that and saying we should do some of this stuff, and probably are feeling that. But I think at the same time, I think a lot of people on the left, and if you like, the liberal progressive class, will see it as an opportunity to define themselves against Trump. They think this is the devil incarnate. And I'm no fan of Trump, by the way, but they'll think this is the devil incarnate. And actually, to show how much we dislike him, we've got to adopt even more hardline variations of the woke agenda, the DEI agenda. Don't be surprised if some of that happens. But I think it's too early to say. But my view is consistent in the sense that if the left continues to peddle the extremes of this stuff, it will continue to lose the votes of working class people in the way it's done over the last 20 and 30 years.
Yeah, I think it's going to become less fashionable, and therefore fewer celebrities will adopt it. I hope so, because we need to be able to talk sensibly again and have rational conversations without fear that somebody's going to report us to someone or some such thing. I've got one more question for you, but where can people follow you and find your work?
They can go to my website, paulembery.com, which is my Substack effectively, and I churn out material regularly on there, articles, videos, podcasts, and so on. I'm quite prolific on X. I can be found there, and I pop up on TV from time to time, as you probably know.
Who's a heretic you admire?
I was thinking about this on the way here. I'm going to go for someone from my movement, the trade union movement, actually. I'm going to go for Lech Wałęsa, who was the leader of the Solidarity movement in Poland in the early 1980s, Solidarność as it was known. And he led the strikes at the Gdansk shipyards against the Polish state, which of course was a communist state at the time, backed up by the mighty Soviet Empire. And in the face of all of that, there were no free trade unions in Poland or in most communist countries at the time. But there was an economic crisis and there was a strike, and he was the leader of the strike in the Gdansk shipyard. And he essentially showed, whether you agreed with his politics or not, he showed enormous courage by effectively facing down an empire and saying, we are not being treated fairly, workers deserve a fairer deal, and I'm going to lead a strike, even if that means you putting me in prison. So he was regarded as a heretic at the time, but someone I do admire.
It's a fascinating heretic. People, please go follow Paul Embery. We'll have links down below to all his stuff. We'll have his book. You didn't mention your book, did you?
Oh, I didn't mention my book, Despised. Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class.
Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class. Book, Twitter, all the things down below. Please go follow him. He's come all this way to be on the podcast. He's been brilliant. So please do that. Hit the like button and keep watching this show.